Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're chasing something almost ineffable. Warning here, there will be spoilers for some stories, but that's to be expected given the topic. Today we're talking about what makes a good or a bad villain. This is a subject that's given me no end of frustration trying to nail down. The term "I know it when I see it" rears its pretty little head and asks me to call it a day, waving the temptation of games and vegging out to distract me. Unfortunate for my leisure, this topic is set on the shelf for far too long. So let's see if we can nail down what makes a villain good, bad, or forgettable. I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can. I've been feeling a bit off lately without going into too many details about my personal life. But first, a message from this video's sponsor, me. Well, kind of from me. My book, Battle Games Book 1, is part of the Narratess summer sale along with several other indie books, starting on the 24th and ending on the 26th. So by the time you're watching this, it'll be starting tomorrow. There are over 300 books on sale, and it's a great chance to pick up some new books and support smaller authors. I'll leave a link in the description to the sale, which again opens tomorrow. Back to the video. Nailing down what makes a villain good is a difficult task. With skillful hands and the proper setting, almost any motivation or character can work. Almost any. That said, the reverse is also true. You can have the most ingenious mastermind with the clearest motivation, but if you handle them improperly, they can end up as a forgettable side note. So what can we do? I'm going to pull from the well of what I've read, watched, and witnessed to try to break down the difficult qualities that make up a truly great or truly terrible villain. Let's start with effectiveness. A villain needs to be effective, and by this, I mean they have to be a threat of some kind. It doesn't have to be world-ending, and it doesn't even have to be violent. The villain can be a soft threat, someone who wants to take the protagonist's position, marry their girlfriend or boyfriend, or simply compete with them in their line of work. This means the villain has to have a realistic chance of winning. This is a tricky situation as usually the villains don't win. This isn't a solid rule, but usually people like the hero to win in some way. I'm reminded of another recent controversy with My Hero Academia, but that's not what this video is about. That's really more of a subject for a video about heroes. The easiest way to phrase this is your villain has to be in some way better than your hero. They can be stronger, smarter, more determined, or even just better established. That last one doesn't work too well long term. This is because we don't celebrate easy wins. Don't get me wrong. There are good stories written about people in bad situations, overcoming obstacles that would be easy for a normal person. That actually hits on my point of being effective better. The villain must be effective to the hero. The predatory drug dealer can be just as effective a villain to the junkie as Lex Luthor is to Superman. In a way, this can be thought of as power scaling, matching the threat to the protagonist. If the win is too easy, people will wonder why you bothered. If the threat is too hard, people will think the hero has plot armor or worse, was never in real danger. The next thing a villain needs is presence. It's not enough that we know the villain exists. The effect of his existence needs to be present in the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the story. The villain is the force the protagonist is fighting against. It doesn't matter if the villain is a force for change or the status quo. It doesn't matter if they're feared or loved. We must know the villain is there, that they're a threat to either the protagonist, what the protagonist wants to protect, or the journey the hero is on. The worst kind of villains just pop up. They have little to no presence in the story until it's time for a fight or a resolution. We see this a lot in modern writing. The story will be plodding on in one direction, and suddenly a wild villain appears to mess some stuff up, only to be defeated by the protagonist in a chapter or two. And then they'll either swear an undying vendetta, or die. While many villains are rarely seen until the final showdown or major plot points, their presence is still felt through the rest of the story. They have left their mark on the world. This can be through fear and awe of the characters, the scars of deeds long past, or hidden secrets that the protagonist, and the reader, can see but other characters are oblivious to, even if it has major influence on them. Your villain should never be hidden from the reader, even if he is hidden from the rest of the world. Does your villain need to be likable? The short answer is no. The longer answer is kind of. The villain doesn't have to be the type of person you'd want to hang out with, but the reader does have to feel something for him. Love, hate, rage, understanding, etc. All of these emotions require presence and action. If you're old like me, you may remember the show Power Rangers, and when it started broadcasting on American shores. And if you're not that old, you probably remember one of the 1,000 derivatives. Every week the heroes fought the monster of the day. These monsters were usually interchangeable and played up mostly for laughs. You felt almost nothing when they were defeated. Even worse were the minions that appeared with the monster. They were just faceless things that showed up in an instant and were dispatched just as quickly. The only villains kids cared about were those that showed up week after week, the big bads, and how they would eventually be defeated. These were the true villains of the piece. Every week they'd create a new monster to terrorize the world. Were they good monsters? Not really. The point is, they were always there. We knew who they were. They had presence in the story, and it gave the viewers a chance to develop some kind of feeling towards them. The Super Sentai might not be the best example for this, but it's an easy to understand one. The point is, your villains won't hit the readers, watchers, or players if they don't live with their presence in some way. They need time to establish how they feel about your villain. Next, we're going to look at a little comparison. This is going to be a tricky subject and an already difficult topic. It breaks down to how are the hero and the villain different. I know a lot of stories that have played the villain is not so different from the hero card. The problem is the villain has to be different from the hero. What usually separates the hero and villain is who's right, who do we like, and who do we identify with. That last one is a big test that a lot of modern writers fail. The big problem with our first point is good and evil becomes a bit more subjective outside the simplest of stories. It's one of the reasons pure good and pure evil don't do so well with complex characters. Most people are neither pure good or pure evil. We all have good qualities and bad, and if we're looked at under a microscope, we'd probably look a lot worse. Few people want to watch you playing video games in your underthings. But being good or evil can help establish a difference, if it's present at all. In our second point of comparison, we have to ask ourselves, who do we like? This is a more solid point than either one being good or evil. People are endlessly complex creatures, and we tend to like people more on the negative traits we share than the positive traits we aspire to. If you don't believe me, just try to bond with somebody over the things you mutually hate. It's a lot easier than the things you mutually like, though it does lead to some very unstable relationships. People who like to binge game will like each other far more than people who aspire to be CEOs. Alcoholics tend to like each other more than competitive athletes. It's the difference of comfort and competition. I may be being a little pedantic about this, but it boils down to this. If your reader works a soul-crushing job and the villain of your piece is trying to take down Megacorp A by stealing their money, your reader is probably going to like your villain more than the hero who's trying to stop it. It is obviously wrong to steal, but your reader feels a sympathy with the villain rather than the hero. To give a sort of example, let's look at the movie Joker that came out a few years ago and its upcoming sequel. This will also get into the who do we identify with. In the first movie, Arthur is a forgotten man. He is kicked around, can't get a date, and is pushed down by everyone around him. He even has a weird laughing problem that puts people off. Then we watch his transformation into somebody who's had enough and is making the world's rejection of him the world's problem. And then around him rise the disaffected. The character and the movie really appealed to the group the mainstream likes to call incels, and it's small wonder why. They identify with Arthur. He's the put-upon man, finally taking what he wants, finally pushing back against a system that kept him down. Then the people who are making Joker 2 said, "We never wanted to appeal to this crowd, and by the way, Joker 2 will be a musical, and we're treating Harley Quinn as a second Joker." I'm paraphrasing here, but back to my point. Whether the first movie was trying to appeal to incels or not, a lot of them really identified with Arthur from the first Joker movie because he wasn't the villain. In this case, he would have been the hero. The system in the city that beat him up, robbed him, and rubbed his face in the dirt was the villain. And it's why so many people cheered when he led it into chaos. Now, from what I understand from what I've read, Arthur will basically be playing sidekick to the new Harley Quinn character, who's been stripped of everything she used to have except her name. I can see why this might be a problem regardless of who it appeals to. I say all that to say, if people like your villain, believe he's right, and identify with him, they're not going to see him as the villain, they're going to see him as the hero, and they're going to resent the hero you've brought in to bring him down. That said, some people want their villains to be somebody the audience can connect with. This is perfectly fine. Some of the most memorable villains are likable and relatable, and that brings us to our last point. Who do we identify with? One of the biggest things you need in your villain is to not be too relatable. In fact, one thing every good villain needs is a hero who is more justifiable to back. The hero must either be significantly more right, likable, or relatable than your villain. If your hero is insufferable, preachy, or constantly shames the reader, people are going to cheer for the villain. If you've never heard "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," well, it applies to reading too. You will have successfully turned the tables and made the villain the lesser of two evils because people relate on feelings. Using another recent example, and this is going to be purely from the chatter I've heard around the movie, because I have not seen this movie, I never intend to see this movie, and the fact that this movie exists just makes the world a slightly dimmer place. Ken from the Barbie movie. The story as I understand it is Ken is basically a second-class citizen in his homeland. It's so bad he doesn't even get to sleep indoors without the permission of a Barbie. Then he comes to the real world and learns that other men, for lack of a better word, don't live like that. They get to have their own homes, their own money, and get to make their own decisions. He then tries this back home and makes changes that allow the Kens status that they've never had before. He tries to codify this into law through an election until the Barbies rig the election by seducing the Kens on election day. Then, Ken is returned to the miserable life he had before. I remember there was a lot of screeching about people sympathizing with Ken when he was supposed to be the enemy. The problem is, Ken was more right for wanting fair treatment, more likable as he was trying to overcome adversity, and more relatable as people generally don't like to side with a character who's trying to oppress the other side. Now, I've heard the explanation for this, that it was supposed to be some kind of mirror for society to look at itself through, or some other such thing. But honestly, I don't care about that. We're talking about the story. I care about what the story shows, and the story shows that the hero was the person who was in power and oppressing the villain, and at the end of the story, the villain is defeated through unfair tactics and is worse off than he was before. In other words, the story failed at setting up a proper hero-to-villain relationship. So lastly, I want to get into some examples of villains and why I think they fit this mold. And I'm going to give my first spoiler warning. If you haven't read the Mushoku Tensei light novels, there's a major spoiler ahead. It may be best to skip to the next timestamp. 3, 2, 1. The Man God is my favorite recent villain, and his impact on the story is both profound and subtle to the people of the six-sided world. The Man God has an odd set of powers. If you were born to the six-sided world and not reborn in it, he can control you through your dreams. He can also see all the possible futures of the people whose dreams he appears in. The people he controls are called his acolytes, and will remain the Man God's acolytes until he moves on to a new person. He can also read the minds of anyone whose dreams he's appeared in, and he is possessed of a frightening level of knowledge. While this makes him sound ridiculously powerful, and he is, he has some major flaws. First, he doesn't exist physically in the six-sided world, rather in the space between where the worlds join. This means he lacks a physical presence to do the things he wants on his own. Second, his ability to see the future of people he controls means he never develops his ability to hypothesize about the actions of others. He is weakened because he is so used to seeing other people's probable futures that he doesn't even spare a thought for what they could be doing while he's not watching. His overwhelming abilities make him a true threat, but it also impacts his lateral thinking. Further, his motives are different. He's not trying to kill the main character, he's trying to stop the main character from meeting his wives and having children. Rudy not being originally from the six-sided world, he has some special traits that make him immune to the man-god's direct control, among other things, and these traits can be passed down genetically. So let's compare him on some of the items mentioned earlier. Is the man-god right? No. Mostly he's doing things for his own amusement or advantage. He is recently acting for his own survival, but again, that's a recent development, and mostly the man-god has been a hindrance to the six-sided world. Is he likable? In a manner of speaking. The man-god is charismatic and capable of manipulating others when he needs to. He often leads people to what they may see, at the time, as boons, though these are often downgrades from what they would have originally gotten. Is he relatable? This is a tougher question. On the one hand, the man-god is currently acting to survive the only threat to his existence that he knows. He is scared and is turning his efforts to eliminating that threat. On the other hand, he's a disembodied figure that controls people through their dreams, and that makes him feel rather monstrous. The things that he drives people to do and the pain that comes from it drive home how malicious he actually is. Does he have presence? While the man-god is not widely known to the people of the six-sided world, his influence is felt by Rudy and the reader both. He is an almost existential threat. Since he can control almost anyone and switch between people at any given time, there is no way of knowing if a person is actually being controlled by him. Since he knows so much about the main character and his weaknesses, he is a substantial threat. This isn't helped by the fact that there are several other enemies and threats that the main character Rudy must deal with. And it's also important to remember the man-god is a master manipulator who can see the freaking future. Moving on to our next example, and it's a little bit obscure. There's no need for a spoiler warning here. I want to talk about Yawgmoth from the Magic the Gathering novel series, starting at the first book, Artifacts. Now, before you rush out to buy books that are nearly 30 years old, or clicking off the video because I mentioned what sounds like a movie tie-in game, hear me out. Yawgmoth is actually a fairly interesting villain. Before he became an eldritch horror stuck in the middle of his own plane of techno-necromancy, he was a regular human. A healer, in fact. He was called to a kingdom that was suffering from an odd sickness which turned out to be caused by the stones they were using to power their civilization. With the help of a planeswalker, a kind of demigod wizard, that's not entirely accurate, but it's the best you're going to get in such a short video, Yawgmoth is introduced to the demi-plane of Phyrexia. It's a beautiful place that Yawgmoth uses in his experiments to cure the population of the city. Well, Yawgmoth, as it turns out, is actually a monster. Several other cities and peoples want him for crimes he's committed against them. Medical experiments and the like. It's really awful stuff. The important people of the city who might have been able to stop him find this out a bit too late. Yawgmoth has already transferred many of his patients to his new home plane and cured them. And by cured them, I mean turned them into abominable monsters that feel no pain and serve only Yawgmoth. In his first story, Yawgmoth is thwarted. He's trapped with most of his creations in his demi-plane when the magical equivalent of a nuke is used on the city. We pick up with him again in the Brothers' War, a few hundred or thousand years later, I can't quite remember. Now, Yawgmoth has become a de facto eldritch god. He lives in the center of the dark smoky hell he's created. He sends out his minions to corrupt any world their literal oil-covered metal claws can touch. As the stories progress, he goes on to not only be the biggest monster in a world filled with some truly terrifying beings, but a horror all his own. As for the metrics I established earlier, is he likable? Kind of. In the first book, he's certainly charismatic. It's easy to get caught up in his rush to cure the population and explore his new possibilities. Is he evil? Absolutely. Yawgmoth is like that old school evil. He's not merely the opposite of good, he is the corruption of good. His influence is a taint on existence, and it's as pervasive as the oils of his home plane. He will gladly corrupt, dissect, and repurpose any life he can. He will destroy civilizations to advance his goal. This is not something he'll do when diplomacy fails. This is his preferred method of acquisition. Is he relatable? A little, when he was human. Later, he's just this monstrous threat that exists outside our own realms. He wants nothing more than to pull everything he can get into his dark, smoke-stained world of death, rebirth, and corruption. Is his presence felt? Yawgmoth is the major villain for almost 2/3 of Magic's history, I think. He was eventually killed, but it took great sacrifice, and basically, though it didn't happen exactly at the same time, kind of led to the reset of the entire universe. Well, multiverse. It's difficult to explain. At least this as far as I can remember in the stories. It's been a while since I've read any Magic the Gathering books. Some of them were pretty good, like the first two, and some of them are... well, let's just say you can't expect much from a book that's given out for free with a deck of cards. Lastly, I feel like I should mention a villain that's a bit more mainstream. As loathed as I am to reach into the Harry Potter bag, Voldemort is a good example of what I'm talking about. For a character that appears as little as he does in the series, his presence is felt throughout the story. His legacy is so terrible, people literally call him He Who Shall Not Be Named. This is admittedly a little heavy-handed, but it does work to set the tone. We further feel his presence in the scar Harry carries, in the lost loved ones of people who surround the main character, and in the things that tie the main character to him. Voldemort is so entrenched in the story that even histories older than himself are reminders of his existence, as we see in the second book with the Chamber of Secrets. Some of this is a bit ham-fisted. Nearly every terrible thing in the story is related back to Voldemort in one way or another, leading to a bit of oversaturation. This also has the problem of bringing things down to simple good and evil, with Voldemort being the avatar of all that is evil. But that's okay. As I will remind you, this is a children's book series and doesn't need to be over difficult. So let's subject him to the other criteria. Is he effective? I'd say so. He is definitely threatening in a way that makes sense in the world. He's not overwhelming or mismatched with the hero of the books. Is he present? As I spent a lot of time explaining before, yes, over much at times. Is he a good foil for Harry? Kind of. Honestly, this felt more of a good and evil story than anything else. Harry and Voldemort aren't exactly opposites. A good portion of the book focuses on their similarities, but also makes a big deal about their choices being what makes them different. And that can be all the difference you need. It's actually a neat little way to compare a hero and a villain. Is Voldemort likable? As a person, no. I personally found him a little too quick to anger and a little too murder-happy for the mastermind I was expecting. Is he evil? By my definition, yes. Cartoonishly so. Is he relatable? Kind of. More in the, I can understand why he is like he is, even if I wouldn't condone it. So what can we take from this, aside from my rambling about evil characters I enjoyed? Well, that's just it. What makes an evil character enjoyable to you? Even if they're not quite evil. Granted, the subject of making a good villain isn't a science. If it were, this video would have been much easier to make, but humans would have been tragically more dull. Hopefully, however, you've gained some ideas on where to start, or, if you like, what to ignore. Good luck, everyone.